lots of people have definitions for the singularity that may differ in various ways. My personal definition for the singularity is that that I think that within the relatively near historical future that humans using technology will be able to create or become creatures of superhuman intelligence. And I think the term singularity is appropriate for that because unlike other technological changes, it seems to me pretty evident that this change would be unintelligible to us afterwards in the same way that our present is unintelligible, our present civilization is unintelligible to a goldfish. Folks sometimes after hearing this will come up and say, well, yeah, but there have been singularities before, like, say, the printing press. The thing is, you could explain to somebody before Gutenberg what a printing press was, and you could actually explain the consequences, even though those consequences might not be believed. And the listener would understand what you're saying. You could not explain a printing press to a goldfish or a flatworm. And in the same way, post-singularity, to have that explained to us now is a qualitatively different exercise than explaining past breakthroughs. So that's why I would say events like the printing press, the invention of fire, the invention of cities, agriculture, all of those are extreme events. But I think the right analogy to the singularity, the technological singularity, is the rise of humankind within the animal kingdom, or perhaps the rise of multicellular life within the Precambrian era. I'd be surprised, let's see, I think the singularity is the most likely non-catastrophic event for the near future. So that doesn't mean that it's certain. It doesn't mean that terrible things might happen instead, but that I personally would be surprised if it hadn't happened by 2030. In my discussions with Eleazar, I think some of the most interesting discussions are in his notions of safety. And we're all familiar with the science fiction that Asimov wrote about the three laws. And Asimov had a significant part of his career was analyzing the consequences of that. And I think one thing that his stories show is the various difficulties with it. And Eleazar's notion of a more nebulous kind of loyalty or niceness is much more plausible. And it certainly, I think, makes sense that if this is the way that we get into human equivalence and superhuman intelligence, then it may very well be that what he's talking about there would be quite important. I think that there are also a number of other ways that we may slide into superhuman intelligence, and that some of them are, relatively weird, and they have their different flavors. Over the years, there's been various anxieties that people have had about the singularity, and I think some of this has been attributed to science fiction, unfairly, of course. There's been science fiction that's actually been quite optimistic about singularity-type events. But I think any time you're contemplating something that can replace the most competitively effective feature that humans have, it's intelligence, that it's entirely natural that there would be some real uneasiness about this. I regard the singularity as the nearest analogy in the history of the Earth is the rise of humans within the animal kingdom. And I think anybody who thinks that, has some reason to you think about that. You say, well, there are some things about that might not be good for humans. On the other hand, I think it's also true, and this is a reason for nervousness, but it's also also points to something larger, and that is thinking about the possibility of creating or becoming something of superhuman intelligence is actually an example of optimism that is so far-reaching that it forces one to carefully look at what they wanted. In other words, humans have been striving to make their lives better for a very long time. We have certain things that are kind of gut instincts about, in the farthest remove, what we want out of life and what is what we want out of the universe. It is very unsettling to realize that we may be entering an era where questions like, what is the meaning of life, are practical engineering questions. And there's no doubt that that should be very unsettling. On the other hand, I think it might be kind of healthy if we sit down and look at the things we really want and look at what they would mean if we could get them. And then move forward from there in terms of trying to make certain things happen or guide things in certain ways. The notion of the signs of the singularity is sort of something that grew out of a basic piece of methodology, and that is using scenarios instead of using trend projections. I see that there are the singularity as a whole is a type of scenario, but there are several paths into it that are very different and perhaps would lead to very different outcomes. And then there are scenarios where the singularity doesn't happen. And for each scenario, a person should consider, for them to be useful scenarios, a person should consider what would be the symptoms you would see going forward as you moved into the different scenarios. And then, as real time passes, you watch for those, and this adjusts probabilities, and in some cases, if it's really effective planning, it may adjust what you're doing depending on how you rate the possibilities. So, as I said in that essay at IEEE Spectrum, there are a number of things a person could watch for, both negative symptoms and positive symptoms. Negative symptoms are ones that make you think, oh, well, that decreases the likelihood that we're on the track for any sort of near singularity. An example of a negative symptom is if you began to notice larger and larger software debacles. In fact, that's sort of fun to write about things like that. You could get very large software debacles. One of the simplest positive ones is just to note whether or not economic motive and the effect of Moore's law is continuing on track. Another thing to watch for is, to me, a fundamental thing that is going on here is that humans are better characterized not as the tool creating animal, but as maybe the only animal that has figured out how to outsource its cognition, how to spread its cognitive abilities into the outside world. We've only been doing that for a little while, like 10,000 years. Reading and writing is outsourcing of memory. So what we've got here is this process, and watch whether it is ongoing. So for instance, in the next 10 years, if you notice more and more substitution of fragments of human cognition into the outside world, if the human responsibility, occupational responsibility, becomes more and more focused on areas of judgment that haven't yet been automated, then what you're seeing is rather like a rising tide of this cognitive outsourcing. And that would actually be a very powerful symptom. There are certain paths to the singularity that would be highly democratizing. For instance, one of the paths to the singularity is that humanity plus its networks and the data on those networks and the supporting computers, that ensemble takes on an intellectual role. And actually, if you compare us to 1985, you already see much evidence of that. And I think the presentation tomorrow about Twine, I believe, is going to be talking about that. And that's an example where, in effect, the people of the world who are participating, their intellectual power has always, in a raw sense, outweighed the best and the brightest that were the captains of state and the advisors to the captains of state. With the internet, these people are finally coming together and talking to one another, and if you participate in the web at all, I think you're quite aware of that. And that sort of intellectual power doesn't mean that governments go away, but it could very well be that it becomes something that becomes the tail that wags the dog of the world's governments. In that sense, it's very democratizing. In fact, that particular scenario I sometimes characterize as being the new populism. Now, this is only actually one type of path to the singularity. I suspect that, as I said in the essay, there are 4 or 5, and they're probably going on concurrently, and they will probably mix together. And some of them look very terribly alien. And terms like democratization and politics and such like that applied to some of these paths, in my mind, provokes kind of a reaction, because it is just so terribly alien.
How come?
50 to 60 years ago, it's a very strange idea. A strange idea. You could only find a relatively small number of people who would be talking about it. Even among people who were talking about the wonders of future technology. If they talked about things like superhuman intelligence, it was generally something that would happen 1 million years from now, you know, when our heads were as big as watermelons and we had grown to an IQ of 400. And at that remove, it's vaguely comforting in the sense that, well, it shows that all our struggle eventually led to something good. Now we're kind of in an era where we think it might happen before it's time for you to retire, and that makes people more nervous. As time goes forward in the 20th century, in fact, I had an essay in '93 where I think I explicitly said this, the shadow of the singularity casts itself backwards in time, and in the early years there were only a few people who talked about it. In the 80s and 90s there were more people who talked about it. Now, in the early 21st century, there's a lot of people who talk about it. I suspect that going forward, as long as it doesn't happen, that it will be an idea that becomes sort of a background, assuming we don't get big physical disasters. You know, if the world blows up, the sun blows up, or we get a big nuclear war, you know, something like that, that's different. But if technology proceeds, I suspect that until the singularity happens, that the notion of the singularity will just become a growing part of the cultural landscape of anybody who is technologically literate, not illiterate. The value of the Singularity Institute and the Singularity Summit in general consideration of the issue is, I believe, the hope that thinking about these things and talking about them and I am certainly not talking about any sort of tax-supported government program to do this, but just people in society thinking about it, increases the chances that what we get out of this will be something that is safer than it would have been otherwise. Personal reason that I would be interested in the Singularity Institute and going to events at the Singularity Institute is just, it would be to see what other people have to say about this sort of thing. As part of this general issue of thinking about it, both pro and con. But by the way, pro and con, I mean skeptical and non-skeptical. I don't mean support or oppose, you know, doing it. Basically, I figure that if the singularity can be accomplished, it is such an economic win, it is such an intellectual win, it is such an artistic win, and it's such a military win that it will happen. But talking about it, and which goes on here at Singularity Institute and other venues, is something that I think is interesting, and it does give us as a whole a chance to think about these issues and perhaps to help to make them turn out in a good way.